In today's video, we're counting down some of the most brutal shark attacks ever recorded. From a bull shark that lurked above a boy who wandered into a shallow channel, to a fisherman who ignored murky water warnings where tiger sharks festered. But first, we begin with an unlucky surfer who suffers the biggest shark attack in history. It was January 17, 2019, and the Pacific Ocean hammered Cape Mendocino with the kind of fury that sends most surfers home. Waves towered over 20 feet, their faces scarred by 45-mile-per-hour winds that tore white spray from their crests. The water churned dark gray, choked with kelp and debris, while overhead the sky pressed down in heavy layers of storm cloud. By afternoon, the coastline would claim its first victim of the season. A young, daring surfer whose experience with big waves would prove tragically insufficient when he became prey himself. Jonah Kepler was a 29-year-old surfer from Eureka, California, a coastal town where the Pacific's fog and swells were as much a part of life as the redwoods inland. He had grown up with the ocean, learning to surf before most kids could ride a bicycle. Over the years, Jonah had built a local reputation as someone who chased extreme conditions that most surfers avoided, earning admiration from some friends and concern from others. His daring nature was balanced by a deep understanding of the sea. He could read tides, currents, and storm patterns with an almost instinctive skill. Yet, despite this knowledge, he was occasionally reckless. Friends recalled him paddling out in winds that tossed experienced surfers ashore, laughing off warnings with a confident grin. They said that surfing was not just a hobby for Jonah, it was his identity, his way of pushing boundaries, and his primary escape from the pressures of work, family, and life in general. He spent nearly every daylight hour on the water, often returning home with numb fingers, sunburned skin, and the satisfaction of having conquered waves that many wouldn't even consider approaching. That winter, Jonah had set his sights on a personal challenge that had been in the back of his mind for years. Riding one of the largest winter swells in recent memory at Cape Mendocino, a remote and rugged stretch of coastline, known for its jagged cliffs, unpredictable waves, and occasional shark activity. Friends said that the plan had been deliberate, rehearsed in his mind dozens of times, and he had prepared accordingly. His truck was loaded the night before with 3 surfboards of varying lengths, a full rack of thick wetsuits, booties, gloves, and extra gear in case conditions worsened. Jonah had texted his longtime friend and local photographer, Eli Warren, early that morning, arranging to meet at the Cape before the swell peaked. Eli, used to Jonah's obsession with extreme waves, had agreed to capture photographs of the event, partly for documentation, and partly out of concern that Jonah's ambitious goals often flirted with danger. The drive from Eureka was long and winding, following coastal roads that skirted cliffs and forests, each bend revealing more of the churning gray sea that had called to Jonah for as long as he could remember. By the time he arrived, the wind had picked up, scattering spray across the rocks, and the waves were already towering, a relentless wall of motion that promised both exhilaration and risk in equal measure. The surf zone at Cape Mendocino stretched nearly a quarter-mile from shore, where waves formed over underwater canyons that dropped to depths exceeding 600 feet. Great white sharks frequent these waters year-round, drawn by dense populations of harbor seals and sea lions that congregate on offshore rocks. Adult great whites can exceed 20 feet in length and weigh several thousand pounds, with bite forces measured at many thousands of pounds per square inch. In murky storm conditions, their hunting combines scent, close-range electroreception, and explosive ambushes from depth when chance brings a seal-like silhouette within range. They are particularly active during storms when reduced visibility gives them advantage, and when the churning water disorients prey species. Eli arrived at the clifftop parking area around 1:30 p.m. and immediately spotted Jonah's truck. Through a telephoto lens, he could see his friend already in the water, perhaps 200 yards offshore, paddling against massive sets that rolled through in chaotic intervals. Eli later told authorities he tried yelling warnings from the cliff edge, but his voice likely never carried over the wind. The local harbor patrol had issued explicit warnings that morning, advising all watercraft and swimmers to avoid the area due to extreme surf and reduced visibility. Jonah had paddled out around 1 p.m., according to time-stamped photos Eli took. The water temperature was 52 degrees Fahrenheit, and visibility was estimated at less than 6 feet. Several fishing boats that had attempted to work the area earlier that morning had reported unusual activity, seals fleeing toward shore, large fish schools scattering, and what one captain described as significant turbulence beneath the surface. These signs suggested predator activity, but Jonah would have been unaware of the radio chatter. Eli's photographs showed Jonah positioning himself beyond the primary break zone, waiting for waves large enough to ride. In 3 of the images, Dark shapes are visible beneath the surface, initially thought to be kelp or debris, but later identified by marine biologists as likely being the shark. The images were partially blurred and grainy from wind, spray, and motion, with only occasional silhouettes of Jonah and the dark shape beneath him clearly visible. For nearly 20 minutes, Jonah bobbed in the swell, occasionally paddling to reposition himself. Eli watched through his telephoto lens, snapping frames every few seconds. Then, between wave sets during a temporary lull, the water around Jonah suddenly erupted. Eli saw the sequence in brutal detail, the massive dorsal fin breaking the surface barely 5 feet from the surfer, Jonah twisting to look, the board lifting partially out of the water as something struck from below. The next frame showed the surfboard airborne, torn free from Jonah's ankle leash, while a massive gray-white shape breached partially, jaws visibly clamped around Jonah's torso. The impact of the initial strike was catastrophic. Great whites attack with upward momentum, hitting prey with their full body weight at speeds exceeding 25 miles per hour. Jonah's wetsuit offered no protection against 3-inch serrated teeth capable of shearing through seal blubber and bone. The shark thrashed violently, powerful head shakes and body twists used to tear chunks from large prey. The first bite clamped across Jonah's midsection while the shark simultaneously bit into his pelvis, effectively separating his upper torso from his lower body. Between waves, Eli glimpsed Jonah still moving, upper body separated and drifting in the surf, while the lower torso sank and rolled in the currents. Jonah went under briefly and resurfaced partially before disappearing beneath an incoming wave. Eli had already dialed 911 within seconds of the initial strike, screaming into his phone about the attack while trying to maintain visual contact with the area where Jonah had been. The call log showed he connected with emergency services at 1:51 p.m. He attempted to climb down the cliff face to reach the water, but was driven back by sheer rock faces and crashing waves that sent spray 30 feet up the bluff. Rescue crews later noted that conditions prevented immediate swimmer deployment and required a hoist operation. The U.S. Coast Guard helicopter from the air station was airborne by 2:05 p.m., arriving at Cape Mendocino 28 minutes after the attack. A rescue swimmer was lowered by hoist during a temporary lull in the waves, but found only debris and the separated torso floating in the surf. Jonah's surfboard was recovered half a mile south, showing massive bite impressions and a severed leash. As darkness approached and conditions worsened, the search transitioned to body recovery. Approximately 3 hours after the attack, a harbor patrol boat located Jonah's lower body near Black Rock, roughly 2 miles from the attack site. The Humboldt County Coroner's Office conducted the autopsy on January 18th. The preliminary report noted catastrophic tissue loss consistent with a 23-foot white shark bite, with a jaw width approximately 18 inches, making it the biggest shark documented connected to a human fatality. The report documented the upper torso nearly severed from the pelvis, multiple serrated lacerations, crushing trauma to the lower body, and injuries consistent with simultaneous bites to the midsection and pelvic region. The cause of death was listed as catastrophic blood loss and drowning. Toxicology results were negative. Jonah Kepler's funeral was held on January 24th at a small chapel in Eureka, attended by university colleagues, fellow surfers, and family members who had traveled from Oregon and Washington. Wildlife authorities issued updated warnings for the entire Cape Mendocino region, and the area was temporarily closed to all water activities. Local authorities installed additional warning signage and increased patrol presence during storm conditions, measures that came too late for Jonah, but that officials hoped would prevent future tragedies. Yet even as Jonah's passion was cut short by a gargantuan shark, a boy in Brazil would wade into a shallow reef channel to examine a tide pool, unaware that bull sharks hunt in water barely deep enough to cover their backs. It was March 11th, 2017, and the Brazilian sun beat mercilessly upon the shallow reefs of Porto Seguro, where the Atlantic Ocean retreated to expose ancient coral formations, studded with tide pools that shimmered like jewels. The water was warm, inviting, and deceptively calm. A perfect afternoon for families seeking refuge from the inland heat. But beneath the crystalline surface, where channels carved by centuries of tides connected deeper pools to the open sea, something ancient and opportunistic had followed the incoming schools of mullet into waters barely deep enough to cover its dorsal fin. Luis Moreira was an 11-year-old boy from São Paulo, visiting Porto Seguro with his parents and younger brother during the extended school holiday. His teachers described him as intensely curious, the type of student who asked questions that derailed lesson plans, but demonstrated genuine fascination with the natural world. His mother, Patricia, worked as a dental hygienist, while his father, Renato, managed a small electronics repair shop. They had saved for months to afford this coastal vacation, their first trip to Bahia in nearly 5 years. That morning, the family had arrived at the secluded beach around 10 o'clock, claiming a spot beneath a cluster of palm trees where vendors occasionally passed selling coconut water and grilled shrimp. Luis was a strong swimmer for his age, but had a tendency toward recklessness that worried his mother. He climbed too high, ran too fast, and ventured too far. His father said that he often defended him as simply adventurous, a boy who needed to explore his boundaries. Patricia had made Luis promise to stay within sight, a promise he had kept loosely at best during previous beach trips. By early afternoon, with the tide receding rapidly, Luis had already identified several small fish species and collected a handful of shells, his excitement growing with each discovery. The reef system off Porto Seguro is a complex network of coral formations, tidal channels, and shallow pools that extend nearly 200 yards from shore during low tide. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous species in these waters, capable of tolerating both salt and fresh water, and known for their aggressive territorial behavior. Adults typically measure 8 to 11 feet in length and weigh between 200 and 500 pounds. Unlike many shark species that prefer deep water, bull sharks actively hunt in shallow coastal areas, particularly during tidal changes, when fish become concentrated in narrow channels. Studies indicate they are responsible for more nearshore attacks in Brazil than any other species, yet their presence is often undetected until they strike. Local fishermen had warned beachgoers that morning about increased shark activity following heavy rains the previous week, which had flushed nutrients and prey fish into coastal waters. A faded warning sign posted near the beach entrance cautioned swimmers to avoid channels and deeper pools during low tide, though the Portuguese text was partially obscured by rust and salt spray. According to Patricia and Renato, they were focused on applying sunscreen to Miguel's shoulders and discussing dinner plans, failing to notice when Luis wandered beyond the shallow pools they had designated as his boundary. The channel was perhaps 6 feet wide, carved through the reef by decades of tidal flow. At its shallowest point, the water reached mid-thigh on Luis's small frame, but within several feet it dropped abruptly to a depth of nearly 10 feet, where it connected to a larger tidal pool. Luis waded into the channel entrance. The water was warmer there, and small fish are visible darting between coral formations below. He knelt at the edge where the bottom began to slope downward, leaning forward to peer into the deeper section. What he did not see was the massive shape that had been circling in the deeper pool for the past several minutes, drawn by the vibrations of his movement through the water. According to the report based on eyewitness accounts, the bull shark struck with explosive force from likely directly below, its 8 to 9 foot body surging upward through the narrow channel, with its bulk slamming into Luis and dragging him beneath. Its jaws clamped around Luis's torso, just below his ribcage for approximately 2 to 3 seconds, a brief but devastating investigatory bite. The impact crushed through skin and muscle, its teeth penetrating several inches into the boy's abdomen. Miguel saw it happen from 20 feet away, where he had been searching for shells in a shallow pool. He saw his brother suddenly yanked downward, saw the water erupt in violent thrashing, and later said he remembered red spreading through the water before his brother disappeared from view. His scream cut through the ambient noise of waves and distant conversation. Patricia turned first, her brain requiring several seconds to process what her eyes registered. Renato was on his feet immediately, sprinting across the exposed reef without regard for the sharp coral that tore at his feet. The shark bit down with tremendous force, shaking its head violently in the instinctive motion that tears flesh from prey, then released within seconds. The channel water, previously crystal clear, became clouded with blood, and Luis's body jerked with each movement of the shark's head. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shark released him and withdrew into the deeper pool before vanishing into the open ocean through a submerged channel. Typical behavior following an investigative bite on unfamiliar prey. Luis's body floated to the surface face down, his yellow swim trunks and dark hair visible against the reddened water that soon began dispersing with the current. The current, subtle but persistent, immediately began carrying him toward deeper water. Renato reached the channel first, plunging waist-deep into the water and grabbing his son by the arm. The boy's weight was wrong, too loose and unresisting. As Renato lifted Luis from the water, the extent of the injuries became apparent in broad terms without focusing on graphic tissue loss. Blood poured from the wounds in pulsing streams. Other beachgoers had begun running toward them. A woman screamed for someone to call for help. A lifeguard stationed nearly 300 yards down the beach had heard the commotion and was sprinting across the reef, slowed by jagged rock and algae. Renato carried his son toward shore, the boy's blood mixing with seawater and running down his father's legs. Luis's eyes were half open, but unfocused. his breathing rapid and shallow, the gasping pattern of severe blood loss and shock. The lifeguard arrived within 3 minutes of the attack, immediately assessing the catastrophic nature of the injuries. He attempted to apply pressure to the primary wound site using a beach towel someone had thrust at him, but the volume of blood loss was overwhelming and unlikely to be survivable without immediate surgical intervention. A second lifeguard arrived with a first aid kit and began attempting CPR as Luis stopped breathing. His skin had already turned a grayish white, his lips blue. An ambulance had been called, but the nearest clinic was 15 minutes away by road, and the beach was accessible only by a dirt track unsuitable for emergency vehicles. The lifeguards worked continuously, compressing the small chest and attempting direct pressure while shouting for others to keep back, but there was no response. Luis Moreira was officially pronounced dead in a municipal clinic at 3:47 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after the attack, though medical assessment indicated death had likely occurred within minutes of the initial bite, due to catastrophic hemorrhage from severed major blood vessels in the abdominal region. The attending physician noted that the victim had suffered catastrophic abdominal trauma consistent with massive hemorrhage. The estimated blood loss exceeded roughly half his total blood volume. The beach was closed immediately following the incident, though it reopened 3 days later after patrols reported no further sightings and no additional evidence of the shark. The Moreira family remained in Porto Seguro for 2 additional days, while authorities completed their investigation and arranged for the transportation of their son's body back to São Paulo. Patricia was sedated by a local doctor after experiencing a complete emotional breakdown. Renato gave a brief statement to police. Miguel, traumatized by what he had witnessed, refused to speak for nearly a week. The incident prompted renewed calls for better signage and mandatory lifeguard presence at remote beaches along the Bahia coast, though enforcement remained inconsistent. While a young boy's curiosity led him into a bull shark's jaws, a lifelong fisherman would wade into the murky surf of South Africa to check his nets, unaware that the 15-foot tiger shark circling his legs had been drawn by the same fish he was harvesting. It was February 28, 2015. The morning sun struggling to penetrate the thick haze that hung over the KwaZulu-Natal coastline. The Indian Ocean churned brown and hostile, still roiling from the torrential rains that had battered the region throughout the night. Sifo Ndlovu was a 52-year-old subsistence fisherman who had spent his entire life working the waters near his village of Mitwalum, a small coastal settlement roughly 50 miles south of Durban. He provided for his extended family, a wife, 3 adult children, and 6 grandchildren, through his daily catches, selling surplus fish at the roadside market near the N2 highway. That morning, Sifo checked his nets at dawn and returned home briefly before heading back out around 9 a.m. for a second inspection. His neighbors later recalled seeing him walk down the beach path carrying his bucket, moving with the deliberate confidence of a man who had performed this routine thousands of times. Sifo had set 3 gill nets the previous afternoon in his usual spot, approximately 80 feet from shore in water that normally reached chest height. The overnight storm had altered the sandbar formations and increased turbidity dramatically, but Sifo told a fellow fisherman he encountered on the beach that the rough conditions often drove fish into the nets, making it worth checking despite the poor visibility. The night's heavy rainfall had created ideal hunting conditions for sharks. The runoff had washed organic matter and fish carcasses into the surf, creating a scent corridor that attracted predators from deeper waters. Tiger sharks are one of the ocean's most formidable predators, reaching lengths of up to 18 feet and weighing over 1,400 pounds. Unlike great whites, which prefer clearer water, tiger sharks actively hunt in murky conditions, using their acute sense of smell, and they can detect electrical fields generated by muscle contractions in prey. Their teeth are serrated and curved, adapted to saw through flesh, bone, and even turtle shell. Most significantly, they are responsible for more recorded attacks on humans than any shark species except great whites, with South Africa's coastline being a known hotspot for tiger shark activity. That morning, an increased shark advisory had been issued warning fishermen and swimmers to avoid entering the water due to post-storm conditions. Signs posted at 3 beach access points stated clearly that recent sightings had been reported. Sifo's wife said that he had seen the signs and heard the warnings, but dismissed them with the same logic he had used for years. He had been fishing these waters since childhood and had never encountered a shark, despite countless hours spent waist-deep in the ocean. A neighbor had actually called out to Sifo as he walked past, gesturing at the brown water and shaking his head, but Sifo had simply waved and continued toward his nets. As Sifo waded into the surf, The water temperature was noticeably warmer than usual, approximately 78 degrees Fahrenheit. The turbidity was so severe that Sifo likely couldn't see his own legs below the knees once he reached thigh depth. Another fisherman saw him move slowly, feeling ahead with his feet for the anchor line that marked where his first net was set. Several people were visible on the beach behind him. 2 women collecting driftwood, and a handful of children playing near the high tide line. The water reached his waist as he located the net and began hauling it towards shore, the rope coarse against his palms. Sifo worked methodically, extracting the fish and placing them in his bucket. He waded slightly deeper to reach the second net, approximately 90 feet from shore, the water rising to just below his ribs. The brown surf swirled around him, thick with suspended sediment that reduced visibility to less than 6 inches. His movements created small eddies and splashes, vibrations that traveled efficiently through the turbid water. The tiger shark had been circling the area, likely drawn by the distressed thrashing of fish caught in the nets and the scent of their blood diffusing through the murky water. Moments later, one of the women collecting driftwood later told investigators she had noticed what looked like a dark shape moving parallel to the shore, though the water's opacity made it impossible to identify. She hadn't thought much of it, assuming it was a large piece of debris or perhaps a dolphin. Sifo was reaching down to untangle a section of net wrapped around the anchor line when the shark struck. There was no warning, no fin breaking the surface, no sudden disturbance in the water pattern. The attack came from the side, the tiger shark striking laterally and clamping its jaws around Sifo's left thigh and lower abdomen. The impact drove him sideways through the water, the shark's powerful body twisting in the characteristic rolling motion that tiger sharks use to tear flesh from prey. The water around him erupted in foam, turning from brown to a darker reddish-brown in seconds. One of the onlookers turned at the sound and saw Sifo thrashing violently, his upper body twisting as something beneath the surface dragged him sideways with tremendous force. The tiger shark's hunting behavior involves powerful lateral strikes and rolling motions designed to saw through tissue with its serrated teeth, and this was precisely what it did, pulling Sifo through the water with violent, twisting movements. The shark maintained its grip for several seconds before releasing, a behavioral pattern often observed in tiger shark attacks, then struck again almost immediately, this time clamping onto his right leg just below the knee. The second bite was accompanied by the distinctive twisting motion that tiger sharks use to remove chunks of flesh from prey too large to swallow whole. Sifo's leg bone fractured. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds of active predation, but the damage was catastrophic. By now, several people on the beach were running toward the water, shouting. The neighbor who had warned Sifo earlier grabbed a long piece of driftwood and splashed into the shallows, but the shark had dragged Sifo into deeper water, where the shifting sandbar created a trough now around 5 feet deep, despite being along the same lateral stretch of surf. A younger man waded in with a coil of rope, attempting to throw it toward where Sifo had been, but visibility was so poor that he couldn't locate him. The water was a churning mass of brown and red, the shark having already retreated into deeper water. One of the people on the coast ran to a nearby beach house and dialed the emergency services number 3 minutes after the initial attack. The call was routed to the local fire and rescue service, which dispatched a beach safety unit from the nearest lifeguard station, approximately 4 miles north along the coast. No dedicated sharkboard vessel was immediately available, so the local unit responded by land and later deployed a rescue ski, while villagers had already entered the surf despite the danger. The beach safety unit arrived 20 minutes after the call. 2 lifeguards entered the water with flotation devices and a safety line, while a third scanned the surf from shore. By this time, a crowd of approximately 30 villagers had gathered on the beach. The lifeguards found Sifo's body, partially submerged in 3 feet of water about 120 feet south of where the attack had occurred. The current had carried him along the shore. His gill nets, still anchored to their weights, were found later that afternoon tangled with fragments of his clothing and what investigators identified as portions of tissue. Paramedics pronounced Sifo dead at the scene at 10:19 a.m. The body was transported to a hospital in Durban, where a forensic pathologist conducted an examination. The coroner's preliminary report noted severe traumatic injuries with bite patterns consistent with a large tiger shark, likely based on the characteristic serrated tooth marks, rolling motion trauma patterns, and the species' known prevalence in the region following storms. The left leg showed near-complete amputation at mid-thigh, with characteristic serrated tooth marks. The lower abdomen and pelvic region sustained massive tissue loss and organ damage. The right leg displayed deep lacerations and fractures below the knee. The cause of death was listed as exsanguination and traumatic shock from multiple shark bites. Blood loss would have been catastrophic and rapid given the arterial damage to the femoral region. Authorities officially recorded the incident as a provoked attack, noting that Sifo had been actively fishing in waters where tiger sharks were known to frequent, particularly following storms, and that the nets and thrashing fish contributed to the provocation. They increased patrols along the affected coastline and issued additional warnings, though the response from the local fishing community was mixed. Many, like Sifo, depended on daily catches for survival and felt they had no choice but to continue working despite the risks. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.